Hello. I thought it might be interesting from time to time if I happen to be reading a book that's on Peter Maurin's recommendation list to share my thoughts on it. And you can see if it's something that you'd like to read at some point, or at least know why Peter put this book on his recommendation list. So if you're not already familiar, Peter did have a practice during much of his lifetime to put lists in the book lists of recommended reading in the Catholic Worker newspaper. Sometimes these were connected to essays and they were meant to kind of like further reading on what he was writing about, but oftentimes they were just completely separate. You'd see in a little, at the end of a page, here's a list of Peter's book recommendations. Oftentimes there's not an explanation of why he's recommending that book. And this book, which I happen to have recently read, Fulton Sheen's The Mystical Body of Christ, is actually one of the last books that he recommended. He recommended it in the July 1943 New York Catholic Worker, but it's not a book that he referenced in his writings. He had time, in a couple of his essays where he briefly quotes just a line of Fulton Sheen, but this isn't a book that he had brought up beforehand. So at first, the question might be, well, why did he include this on his book recommendations? And so that's, I was going to kind of go through this book and give my theory as to why he recommended this book back in 1943. So first off, yes, The Mystical Body of Christ by Fulton Sheen. If you're not familiar with Fulton Sheen, when he wrote this book, 1935, I believe, he was a well-known priest. He had a radio program from 1930 to 1950. Shortly after that, he became a bishop, and as bishop, he had a television program, which was very well known in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s. So, a very well-known priest, especially during the first half and middle part of the 20th century. So, this title, The Mystical Body of Christ, one might assume, and I must admit, even myself kind of assumed, I don't think of Fulton Sheen as like a huge social justice advocate, but I think of him as kind of he is someone who promotes what is kind of standard views of Catholic thought. And so I actually was expecting there to be perhaps a greater emphasis on social justice than what was in the book, which I'd say was almost nothing. I mean, he does discuss the implications of being a part of the same mystical body of Christ means that, one part of the body needs to care for the other, but there's, no sustained emphasis or discussion on racism, labor issues. Just think of a social justice issue, it probably, if it's even mentioned, it's not discussed or not mentioned. So it really is, that's not the emphasis of this book. The emphasis really is a defense of the Catholic Church. For example, some of the chapters, one of the chapters addresses scandals in the Catholic Church and how to put them in context and understand them properly. Another is on the infallibility of the Church. Another is on the authority of the Church. As I mentioned again, social justice comes up more seems more of an afterthought towards the end of the book. So even though Dorothy Day, often used the notion of the mystical body of Christ to promote her views of social justice, that would not be found in this book. It's obviously not the reason that Peter Maurin recommended this book. The last chapter of the book is on Catholic action. And so, that one could make a legitimate argument like, oh, I bet it was because of this notion of Catholic action. It was a notion that Peter Maurin promoted, especially in the early first year or two of his writings in the New York Catholic Worker newspaper. And kind of a quick working definition, Catholic action is seen as the action of lay people, so the average person in the pew who's not a priest or a nun, the action of lay people in the world to bring their faith into the world, to help transform the world, but as directed by the hierarchy, especially bishops, perhaps priests who've been appointed to that task. So it is seen as there's a very close relationship here where the hierarchy, the bishops are seen as kind of guiding this action, the action of the lay people in the world. And this was something that in the first year or two of the newspaper, Peter Maurin promoted quite heavily at times, and especially the first year when before the Catholic Worker started its first house of hospitality, it was just an idea in the pages of the newspaper, and Peter Maurin was promoting this notion, promoting ideas like houses of hospitality, and hoping that the bishops would take the lead and that lay people would be involved with these actions directed by the bishops. But by the end of the first year, the Catholic Worker newspaper, Dorothy Day, in December of 1933, starts the first Catholic Worker House of Hospitality, and then others start up by lay people on their own all over the United States. And the bishops aren't involved. They never responded or felt inclined to respond to Peter Maurin's call. And so as Peter Maurin saw that the bishops weren't involved and weren't going to be taking the lead, and sees that in reality it's going to be lay people taking the lead and lay people working to transform the world by following his program, he drops the notion of Catholic action. So that's probably not why he's recommended this book. It'd be strange for him 10 years, about 10 years after he stopped promoting, almost 10 years after he stopped promoting Catholic action, to say, oh, here's a book on Catholic action that I want to recommend. So again, why is he recommending this book? I think probably the only legitimate reason that comes to my mind why he's recommending it in 1943 is because of how seriously he took evangelization. And I think this is an aspect of Peter that often gets neglected or forgotten, that Peter took evangelization seriously, even though he was friends with many people who were not Catholic, who were Protestant, who were Jewish, who were atheists, and his friendship wasn't conditional on whether they would join the Catholic Church. He was always in a posture of inviting people to join the Catholic Church. He viewed that as the best way that someone could live out their lives, would be to be connected to the Catholic Church, and his entire social program was based on his understanding of what he saw as the best of Catholic theology. So we do see, early on in the Catholic Worker movement, there's what's sometimes referred to as the Harlem Experiment, where the Catholic Worker had access to a storefront in Harlem, and Peter with some others, they open the storefront, they have roundtable discussions, there's art classes, French classes and pamphlets about Catholicism. And he really was hoping that this would, that kind of being, having this storefront in Harlem, which could show what he viewed as the best of Catholicism with its social program to help transform our world during the Great Depression, would lead to a great influx of African-American converts to Catholicism. And that didn't happen, and the storefront didn't last that long. If we move then to the late 30s, early 40s, Peter Maurin really wanted to have a program in place where there'd be outreach to Jews to become Catholic. And he was in conversation with priests who had been raised Jewish but were converts to the Catholic faith and had become priests and were on board with him about this idea, but it never really materialized. Also, if we kind of fast forward around the same time as his hopeful plan to reach out to Jewish people. He has essays in the early 1940 issues of the Catholic Worker on birth control, which initially seemed really out of place, because Peter in his essays and his writings almost never talks about sexuality. His emphasis is usually on creating a new society or looking at the history of how we got here and where we should go from here. But those issues, those essays that he wrote on birth control really seem, the reason for their writing seems to be he saw the birth control issue as a reason that some people might not want to join the Catholic Church. And so he wrote some essays promoting the Catholic Church's ban on birth control. And I would say that this book seems to follow suit with his hope for evangelizing, and that this book, I'm assuming he hoped that it would be read either by non-Catholics who would be influenced or persuaded by its arguments for the Catholic Church as an institution, organization, spiritual home, or for Catholics to read and to kind of help formulate their own ideas when they're talking to non-Catholics about how they could best address concerns or arguments from non-Catholics about why they would not want to join the Catholic Church. So that I think is probably the most reasonable or logical reason that I believe Peter Maurin recommended this book, and why he was hoping that people might read it. So I hope you found that helpful. Might give you a reason to either read the book or decide not to read it, but either way, hopefully you found this interesting, and I'll report back with other books from time to time.